locking. According to Shaney, by day she's a boring corporate attorney. However, by evening she's an avid reader, anything in print, and most recently she's been reading a biography on Andrew Jackson. Shaney believes that if Andrew Jackson were alive today, he would be a candidate for the real American Idol show. And wouldn't it be nice if we had a show like that instead of all of the other reality shows that are on TV today? But perhaps we'll have a chance to find out, because the title of Shaney's speech is Real American Idols. It's her 7th speech, so please join me in welcoming Shaney to the lectern.
Thank you, Madam Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and honored guests. Can anyone tell me who this is? Paris Hilton. Exactly. Now the hard question, why is she famous?
She's a tramp.
She's a tramp? She's acted like a bimbo on a farm? I really don't know. Let's talk instead about some people who are truly deserving of our recognition and emulation. The justices of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the highest court and the final arbiter of law in the United States. They have the greatest constitutional review powers of any court in the world, and none has exercised that authority for as long or with as much influence as the Supreme Court of the United States. The Constitution established the Supreme Court, but it was silent about the composition and the procedures of the court. So it was actually Congress in 1789 with the Judiciary Act that established a number of justices. And that Judiciary Act has changed over time, and today we now have 1 Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices. They are nominated by the President and approved by the Senate. They served for good behavior, so essentially a life term until they retire or are impeached, which has only happened once. The Supreme Court justices are responsible for balancing out the power. They provide checks and balances against the legislative and the executive branches of the country. Now, we all know that the United States is an extremely complex and sophisticated society. Well, that results in a lot of disputes, and some of them can't be resolved except in court. Now, the Supremes are not hearing about our traffic violations. They're not hearing about your disputes with your neighbors. The current Judiciary Act has limited Supreme Court cases to just those cases that the Supreme Court chooses to hear after a litigant has applied for a writ of certiorari, or sometimes called cert. And that is just a Latin phrase for an order to present your case for appeal. So before a case can ever get to the Supreme Court, it has to start at the lower courts and go through all the levels of appeal before you can even apply for cert. If the Supreme Court chooses to, or if the Supreme Court rejects your case, then the last Court of Appeals decision is the final decision on your case, whether you like it or not. The Supreme Court will typically choose cases that present a new constitutional issue or that represents a split in the circuits. And the country is split up into different circuits. Georgia is in the 11th Circuit. For example, California is in the 9th Circuit. If there were 2 very similar cases that came up through those circuits, but the 2 circuits decided differently on that same issue, then the Supreme Court is more likely to hear one of those cases on appeal. The Supreme Court is also required to hear cases that involve disputes between 2 states or between 1 state and the federal government, because of course, who else could make those decisions? The Supreme Court's decisions are final and binding on the lower courts. But just as our society changes over time, so too does the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution change. That helps explain, in part, why in 1857, I think that's right here, 1857, in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, why the Supreme Court could rule that people of African descent were not protected by the Constitution and could not be citizens of the United States. And I think we all agree today that that was a horribly erroneous decision. And yet in 1954, in Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court decided that racial segregation in schools, in public education, was unconstitutional. Landmark cases are not always about social issues. So for example, in a recent case in 2005, in Kelo versus the City of New London, the Supreme Court decided or upheld the city's right to seize non-blighted private property and transfer that property through eminent domain to a private developer for the purpose of increasing municipal revenues. That was a case, a legal case, about government authority versus individual property rights. Now that case generated a huge public outcry and resulted in some states passing statutes that actually limited the state's power of eminent domain. So not only was it a legal case isolated to the Supreme Court, but it was ultimately a decision that was part of democracy in action. Because while the Supreme Court decides the legality, the people can turn around and change the law as well. And there's a great book about this case. It's called The Little Pink House. And it's actually got a picture of the house on it. It's in hardback right now. And it's a really quick read. If you have a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. So it really gives you a full picture of the people behind the case as well. So the Supreme Court isn't just applying a set of rules fixed in stone. They are struggling to apply very vague principles. And their decisions move the point of equilibrium between the society's need for order and the individual's right to freedom. Now, with the benefit of time, sometimes those decisions can seem like huge mistakes, and sometimes those decisions can seem like a flash of brilliance. So, to conclude, I have another picture for you. Hopefully you all recognize this person as well. Sonia Sotomayor, who was recently appointed to the Supreme Court. She actually officially joined last week on August 8th. And regardless of whether or not you agree with her jurisprudence, I hope that you can agree with me that the role that she is undertaking is extremely important and far more worthy of our respect and adulation than any of the people that we read about in Us Weekly.